it's unbelievable that here we are again talking about a situation that doesn't seem to be going away. What is your first reaction as we watch what unfolds in Texas?
Well, I hope we can never become numb because it's so horrific. I hope we all are equally shocked and horrified. I think one of the first things that occurred to me was, we had that bit of a respite during the pandemic when schools were not in session. And I think that in many ways we sort of forgot how this feels and we sort of, became complacent again. And I think this is another shocking and horrific example of the reality that school safety work is never done.
And we've known each other now, I don't even know how long, probably more than a decade here, as I followed the work that you and Dr. Amanda Klinger both do in talking to schools across the country. What do you find is the reason why America cannot seem to get out of this cycle of gun violence and mass shootings?
Well, I mean, I think there's some unpopular truths that really need to be confronted. We have these horrific events that happen, and we immediately go to our political corners and start arguing about gun rights or gun control, and we never get beyond that conversation. And we never get beyond talking about the middle of the commonality, the common ground that no one wants to ever see this happen again. And if we start from that place of what are some of the things we can do, and a gun debate alone will never solve this issue. We have to talk about mental health. We have to talk about societal structure. We have to talk about what is going on with our kids, what's happening, what can we do to restore some semblance of order in our families and in our society. What can we do to train school folks to respond? What can we do to ensure the safety? What can we do to prevent violence? We have to look at all of the things that are staring us in the face instead of immediately retreating to one position and just screaming at each other about guns. We have to have honest, collaborative conversations about an array of issues that surround this kind of horrific event.
You talked about finding common ground in your studies of all these shootings across the country. Have you found similarities, I suppose, that would possess people to want to go into these schools to hurt children? Is it that mental health aspect? Is it that connection to the school? What is it?
I think there's a lot of research, not just ours, but the Secret Service, the Safe School Initiative study. There's a lot of research that looks at one of the commonalities being that no one either picked up on or did anything about the warning signs that were staring them in the face. And I'm not saying that that's true in this particular case because it's too early to say, but in general, there were overwhelmingly dangerous signs that were there, that were present either in the school or in the home or in the community or somewhere, that were not dealt with, or that there weren't supports in place to be able to deal with those kind of issues. That's clearly one of them. And we are not typically taking a proactive approach to school safety. We are spending a lot of time and energy training for what to do when the shooting starts, but we're not spending as much time and energy on preventing that from happening to begin with. What can we do to identify individuals who are at risk for violence against themselves or others through threat assessment? And that conversation began after Parkland, but then the pandemic sort of shut that down and we took our eyes off the ball. We were really moving with a good deal of momentum towards trying to be more proactive about identifying folks. Well, now we have come off of 2 years of social isolation and trauma and an incredible amount of anger and angst in the country and division and this high rhetoric where we are calling each other awful names and doing really divisive things to each other. And then we wonder why people act out and lash out in this violent fashion when this has been building and building and building. So That's why I go back to my earlier comments of we have to attack this problem from all the angles and all the areas that it springs from, and not just latch on one thing and fixate on that. We have to really look comprehensively at what's been happening.
I liked how you talked about threat assessments, because I know that is something that your organization, the Educator School Safety Network, really focuses on. Right now, for those families in Texas, they're grieving horribly, and I think the country's grieving with them. And so as a parent and as educators who are about to let their kids go off into the summer, what should we, as parents, teachers, society, be looking at specifically then when it comes to threat assessments? How do we assess what is a potential threat?
I think it goes beyond threat assessment. When you're asking the question of what should parents, we should be waking up. We should be standing up. We should be talking to each other. We should be advocating, not just for school shooting response. And I know that sounds so contradictory as we're here talking about this horrific tragedy, but we have to advocate for more than just active shooter training. We have to advocate for mental health support. We have to advocate for threat assessment. We have to advocate for preventative measures, for training for teachers. We have to advocate for training for parents to get involved, for people to identify what's happening in their own homes and be able to get support for that. So we have to stand up. We can't just sit back and go, this was awful. There's nothing we can do. There is so much we can do, but everybody has to do something, and it can't start by screaming at each other. It has to start with what can we do together, because that's the only way you solve it.
And as we're learning more about this situation in Texas, they've identified the shooter as an 18-year-old associated with the school in some way. Is that common to have that kind of relation?
It is very common. It's interesting. Clearly, schools have to be concerned about an outside intruder coming in, which is exactly what happened here. But typically, there is some affiliation with the school. It's typically a current or former student, current or former employee. There is some affiliation. And that really goes to the problem that I see every single day in the work that I do, is this disconnect, this lack of connectedness, where kids are going to school, they don't feel part of it, they don't feel connected to the school, they feel like they're being forced to be there, they don't have relationships, they don't have any value in what they're doing, they don't see the value. People commit violence in places they don't feel they have a connection to, or when they're trying to strike back at a place that they feel has not fulfilled their needs or been what they needed. And so we have got to start looking at our kids who feel disconnected and try to build those relationships and figure out what's happening with them, and not wait until this rage and this dysfunction has built to this crescendo that results in a horrific event like we saw today.
Dr. Klinger, what do you feel is the biggest mistake that we as a society could do coming out of this latest mass shooting? Maybe something that you've seen repeated over and over again. Like you said, we were on a trajectory after Parkland, but something happened, it went away, our attention went elsewhere.
I think the biggest mistake is for us to look sad for a minute and then move on. The biggest mistake is to use this as a political tool to beat our opposition with. I think those are big, big mistakes. And I think that's why we keep repeating this same tragic history over and over. We need to look at it from that collaboration that I talked about, that center approach of, we have to have a variety of tools in the toolbox to deal with this. It cannot just be, if every gun in the planet immediately evaporated, we would still have issues with violence in schools. So we cannot keep focusing on the wrong thing. We need to start focusing on all the things, not just one thing. And I think that's the big mistake we've made repeatedly, is we have been unwilling to do the hard work of looking at all the different factors that led us to today's tragedy.
Well, I know as a parent, the hard work is tonight explaining to my child again what happened and the why. And, you know, when you have children who are growing up with this perspective of these things happening, you
Yeah.
can't explain to them how it's
And
going to
that's a
be.
real, and that's a real problem because it becomes as horrific as and mind-boggling as this tragedy is. It's difficult sometimes for kids to put it in the proper perspective of how rare these events are, and they are statistically really rare. Doesn't make them any less horrific, but we have to be able to balance the need to do the work to make our kids safe, but also to be concerned about all aspects of school safety and to make sure that our kids understand that their schools are an important, safe place to be. But then we have to provide that safety for them as well, which goes back to that theme of collaboration of the school has to work with parents and parents have to work with the school. And there's got to be more than just finger pointing in the wake of these kind of tragedies.
I remember there was a time, Dr. Klinger, where and this might have been 10 years ago, so the numbers might be skewed, right? But I remember, based on the data coming in, that we used to see this trend of violence at the start of school and towards the end of school. The start of school, the stresses, maybe of students getting back, the pressures, and then at the end of the school, kind of the same thing. Do you feel that that's still the case now?
To a certain extent, yeah, I think that there is an uptick in the spring. Typically, especially these really horrific, mass casualty events tend to happen in the spring like this. But I also think there's also a component of media coverage and the copycat element of, you just had some high profile events that didn't take place in the school, but and I think some of that is there's this really intensive coverage. There's really a lot of notoriety to the shooter, and that fame, that infamy is very attractive to some folks, to some potential perpetrators. So I think that's clearly always an issue with it as well. But I think it can be a catalyst to potentially identify somebody who is crying out for help right now, who is not getting the support and their needs met. And so hopefully the conversations that these kind of things start can prevent future tragedies.
Well, Dr. Klinger, as always, I appreciate your insights. Your knowledge of this is beyond words. And I'm just sorry that we have to once again talk about this topic, but hopefully through education and your message, maybe there will be change.
And I think there should be that message of hope. There is something we can do. No one should sit at home going, there's nothing we can do. There is so much we can do. We just have to have the will to do it.
We do. Dr. Klinger, thank you so much.
Thank you.